Hey, I'm Zeb,
And I'm Maddie.
and welcome to the We Don't Know Yet podcast. Whilst both Maddie and I are healthcare practitioners, we understand that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to healthcare. Should you require any medical attention, please seek out your local healthcare practitioner.
Alrighty, well, today we are joined with a very special guest, our first Zoom guest, and I'm really excited.
I'm nervous but excited.
There's been a lot of moving parts to this. So we are joined by Elyse Lawry. She is a personal trainer and a student exercise physiologist, and she is rather better known as your period PT on Instagram. Elyse, welcome.
Hi guys, thank you for having me. It's an absolute honour to be your first Zoom guest.
Very excited.
Yes, I'm equally excited to be here.
Amazing. Well, to kick us off, Elyse, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe your background on, where you or how you ended up where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably going to be the hardest question you guys asked me today, to try and condense it into an elevator pitch, essentially. I guess the best way to start is I've had up and down relationship with exercise, probably from my early teenage years, also with exercise and my body. Kind of went through different phases as I grew up into my early mid-20s. And it wasn't until my mid-20s that I came off birth control that I'd been on for a really long time at that point and realized that I didn't actually have a period. So I kind of delved into what could be the cause, because at the time I was also starting my university degree in exercise sports science. So a few things were kind of marrying up for me and starting to make a little bit more sense. And then I learned about hypothalamic amenorrhea, which I'm sure we will touch on shortly. And that's when things started to kind of unfold, and I started to actually realize I didn't have the healthiest relationship with food nor with exercise. And as someone who'd been a personal trainer for almost 7 or 8 years at that point, I was, quote unquote, preaching health and fitness to all of these people, thinking I knew what it took to be healthy and fit. And it kind of turned out that I had no idea in the end.
Oh, wow.
And I think it's it's one of those things, isn't it, where a lot of the time we angle a lifestyle that's so active and so, if you've got that drive for the health and fitness space and you really like to be an active person, you kind of think more is always better, It's such a common misconception across the board. And this sounds like, it sounds like you explored that a little bit or uncovered that once you actually started to break it down a little.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, more is not always more when it comes to movement, especially if it is impacting other areas of your health. So that's a little bit about kind of my history. And then in 2020, I was diagnosed with HA, hypothalamic amenorrhea. We shorten it to HA because it is a bit of a mouthful. And I also got diagnosed with an eating disorder. And I probably would self-diagnose myself with a little bit of exercise addiction or dependency. So I kind of had the trifecta that we see in this space. And in 2020, amongst COVID and all of that sort of stuff, that's when I started to really unpack all of these things and recover from all of the above. Not on my own. I had a lot of support around me, and now I get to do the same thing to others going through similar experiences. So yeah, it's actually a really rewarding space to be.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. And look, I think it's important, or it's so valuable that you are so vulnerable about your story, because with someone with a personal trainer background, it can be as you said, it's so common in the industry. So for you to sort of go against the grain and really speak out about your experiences, it is really amazing.
Oh, thank you. I just love to talk, so that helps.
Likewise.
That's always a positive.
We'd like to take a break from today's episode to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, Drip Digital. They manage all of our audio and video editing as well as our social media marketing. Without them, the We Don't Know Yet podcast wouldn't be possible. So thank you again.
I find it really interesting what you said about the coming off the birth control pill as well, and realizing that you didn't have a menstrual cycle, because I definitely have a lived experience of that. And I feel like it's such a band-aid approach for so many women. They go to their GP that, I'm not menstruating regularly, or I haven't had my period in X amount of months. And you just given the prescription rather of the pill, and it's meant to be a bit of a cure-all, but it's definitely not.
And
No.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, because again, I feel very, very
outnumbered here.
Not necessarily outnumbered, just more I feel like I don't have a leg to stand on when talking about some of this stuff sometimes. But you go to the GP, especially in those teenage years, and you might be suffering from other problems as well. But
Yeah.
like, it sounds like a lot of females are having issues with things like acne and stuff like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
The GPs then go through the process of same thing, prescribing for stuff like that. And it just blows my mind that, again, it's a prescription.
Band-Aid.
Yeah, it's a prescription space where it's just kind of like, oh, just go on the pill because,
Yeah.
But it seems more and more these days that there's actually conversation about a lot of this stuff before that process takes place, or it's becoming, I think the spotlight's starting to move a little bit on that space in terms of, well, actually, it might not be the best thing for you to be on the pill. Like, it might be, better to actually be off it and using other forms of contraception if that's the pathway that you want to go down. So,
and to be fair, while you do lack the ovaries to menstruate, your partner also is, very health informed and very educational about, women's health.
Agree. And I think that's where my eyes have been opened in this space a little. Like, I'm sure Gabby won't mind me discussing her kind of ongoing journey with it, but she as well has had the experience of coming off that oral contraception and then having to navigate that space of, right, like,
what do I do?
What do I do? What are my hormones doing? How does that all change now that I'm not taking this oral contraceptive? It's such an interesting space because you're right. There's not just, it's not as simple as just coming off and all of a sudden everything goes back to normal before you started taking the pill.
Yeah.
It's like there's this whole journey that takes place afterwards, which people need to kind of hear about and understand.
Yeah.
And I think that gives you a really good kind of basis of informed consent when it comes to actually signing up and taking the oral contraceptive pills.
So speaking of journeys, we've definitely gone down a tangent, Elyse.
We have.
I want to pick up where you left off.
My goodness, I can't remember where I left off, to be honest. I was just going to agree with you guys on everything that you just said.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, why don't you tell our listeners how you kind of got into the work that you do now and what you actually do now as well, because we haven't really introduced that either.
Yeah, so essentially how I got into what I'm doing is through my own experience and working with other health professionals in the field. So a big part of my journey, I had my now current boss, Sarah Liz King, help me through my own recovery, particularly in the reintroduction to exercise post HA and ED recovery. And I now work with her and have many one-on-one clients who I help coach through hypothalamic amenorrhea recovery, eating disorder recovery, or disordered eating, because I think that's really important. And I'm sure we'll get into the whole HA conversation, but you can lose your period without actually having an eating disorder. You can lose your period without actually being in a quote unquote small body. It can happen in so many different body shapes and sizes. So I work with women who don't just have, diagnosed eating disorders, but also disordered eating, because they're both equally deserving of being treated and healing from.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned, I guess, the whole HA. I'm going to say HA because there's no way on earth that I'm going to be able to pronounce the whole word.
Oh, stop it.
Like, I know the hypothalamic part. I always get tripped up on the amenorrhea. I actually had to Google it yesterday and teach myself the syllable breakdown.
How to say it.
I love that.
Seriously. I guess from your experience and with your own, level of expertise, what are some common reasons that active women might, lose or become a bit infrequent in their menstrual cycles?
Yeah, so I think the most common reason that I've experienced personally, and a lot of my clients experience when it comes to exercise and irregular or absent periods, is the lack of energy availability. So it's not that I'm going to sit here as a student exercise physiologist and personal trainer being like, exercise is bad, but when it's paired with, not eating enough or being undernourished and underfueled, that's when, if we're doing this chronically, it can cause a lot of health issues like irregular periods, which tend to be the first sign. And then if it continues, your period may stop altogether. And I know some people out there might think, oh, this is a great thing, but I'm sure we'll touch on it. It's not necessarily a good thing to have your period go MIA.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was just going to say in that as well, the concept of training cycling and following that hormonal cycle as well. How do you see that, factor into that as well? Because it's such a big thing, right? And a lot of the stuff that I've been reading or listening to has been talking about making sure that in the lead up to your period, you're actually respecting your body a little bit, giving yourself a little bit of a break from some of that more intense or switching a little bit of the movement that you're actually doing. Is that something that you see pretty regularly as well?
So I love this question because I think with social media these days, it's obviously great that we can get so much information out there. But I think when it comes to the menstrual cycle and training, there isn't a lot of research as of right now. It's definitely changing, but there are those kind of like fitness influencers out there that are like, this is how you should train throughout your cycle. And I mean, there is a little bit of science behind it, but not enough to be definitive. And I think it's really important when it comes to the individual that they learn their own cycle and how they feel rather than basing it on, I guess, kind of just like a generalization. Obviously, our hormones do fluctuate and change throughout our menstrual cycle, and understanding that is really powerful. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your exercise needs to change, if that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's interesting. And like I think I listened to a podcast a few years ago, and it was looking at sport at kind of the elite level and how they kind of monitor training loads, just like they would, whether it was a male or a female, kind of like elite level sporting team. But how they, like you said, individually have to actually monitor the females' kind of training load just to make sure that we're not overstressing or kind of putting their body into a little bit of distress, making sure that they're doing all the right things around that training phase and training cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when it comes to like your menstrual cycle, like if we look at it from like a physiological point of view around ovulation, we have more testosterone in our body, like it peaks slightly compared to our male counterparts. It'll never be as much. But based on that physiology, you could, assume that we would be stronger at that point in our cycle. However, you might have an individual who gets really horrible ovulation pain or cramping and they don't want to be in the gym. So I think that's where I come from with the whole, using your menstrual cycle to help kind of adjust and modify your training as you see fit, like as you feel. And that can change from cycle to cycle, person to person. So yeah, that's until there's more research, which it's obviously changing, and there's definitely more research coming out in women's health, which is amazing to see. Until there's more kind of definitive research, I think, it's a little bit of a buzz, like
Buzzword.
fitness trend.
Theme.
Yeah.
I think as well, until like that research kind of comes through, or even when that research comes through, it's not going to take away from the fact that it is an individual experience for each person, like you said.
Absolutely.
Each person goes through their own thing, which means that they kind of have to manage their own.
I love that you say that as well, because our biggest philosophy in two very separate areas of health and the way that we practice is, health isn't a one size fits all thing. So I love that you've really approached, training around the menstrual cycle is not a one size fits all thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that describes it perfectly, Maddie. Yeah.
Yeah. And off the back of that, how does intense physical activity impact menstrual health in your experience?
Again, that kind of comes back with my experience and my clients. Intense exercise is not necessarily a bad thing. I think two things that we need to think about here is what are the intentions or kind of the underlying agenda to that intense physical activity? Is it part of a well-structured training program that incorporates rest days? Because rest is just as important as the training, if not more important, because if you can't give your body that time to rest and recover, you're not going to see long-term kind of progress or adaptations. And then again, coming back to that at being adequately nourished. So yeah, that's kind of the biggest thing is when it's paired with kind of the wrong reasons around training and being adequately underfueled and overworked, that's when intense physical activity can really impact the menstrual cycle. However, in saying that, any form of activity can impact the menstrual cycle if it's done to kind of that level. It's not just high intensity, but that does tend to be a bit of a culprit.
And I really like that you mentioned the fact of not incorporating a rest day or some sort of cyclic off activity kind of day in a routine, because it is something that you see people on a day-to-day basis really just omit. Like they kind of get rid of it, and it's so commonly seen in private practice. We get people coming in, they're like, oh, I don't know what happened. I was training, I've been training really well all week.
7 days a week.
7 days, yeah. And you just kind of like you must be exhausted.
Yes, I also work in a local F45 gym, and I see that all the time. And I strongly encourage people to take breaks and have rest. Because, and I mean, I used to subscribe to that, more is more. Like you said earlier, Seb, like my rest days would involve like a 5-kilometer walk and, 45 minutes of yoga. Like I was not resting. For anyone out there, that is not a rest day, because it was all intentional and it was a lot of movement, even when I would try and like say it was a rest day.
Yeah, like active recovery. Like, it's helpful and it definitely has its place, but it's not a rest day. They're not equivalent.
Yeah, you're not switching off. Your body's still highly strung, and because you're thinking about it as well, right? And that cycle. I mean, I think we're going to touch on it later, but that psychological influence as well is enough to just really drive that.
Yeah, I'll tell you what though. Like the past couple of months, I've definitely pared back my exercise to the point where I've been having a lot more rest days than usual. I don't think a number here is important, so I've got flies everywhere on me. But I've found like I feel a whole lot better for it. Like not only do I actually look forward to going to the gym or going for a run or something a whole lot more, but I actually feel like I'm, not so fatigued, not so sore, getting a whole lot fitter, which is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Less is more in this case.
Yeah, definitely.
And to touch on the last kind of side before we transition and talk a little bit more about HA, like goes back to what we were talking about last week, right? With Luke, with this, making sure you're not feeling extremely sore walking out of the gym, or you're not, I think it's such a big misconception. Yeah, people think they need to feel it. They need to feel it for it to actually be doing something.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time that's the sign that the body's actually going,
help.
Yeah, I'm under some serious stress.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, working in F45, I can imagine that you would see that, people coming up and sign up and going, I've got to push the heavier weight or the higher weight because I've got to feel it tomorrow morning. Yeah, like I think it's ingrained into a little bit of culture. Hey?
Yeah, I usually tell people if they speak to me when they first sign up to F45, they definitely get a different kind of approach to fitness. Not saying anything bad against my fellow colleagues, but just with my own experience, right? And I'll always say, like, start off slow, come for 2 sessions and then slowly build up to 3, listen to your body, slow down. Like, I don't want you to be too sore that you don't want to come back. Like, I want you to enjoy this. And if you're in serious pain constantly from training, you're going to not want to, and that's kind of a big thing with exercise adherence, which is a whole different kind of topic of conversation. But it's absolutely valid. Yeah.
And it is hard because there is that line and where people do, come for the friends that are going, so they might sign up to all the same classes that their friends are going to, and it is really hard because whilst their friends might be able to kind of cop that load and they've been going for like the last 4 years and you've just signed up and you're like, oh yeah, I can do the same thing.
Or even just gym memberships with like, 5 classes a week. I'm like, that's a lot. I'm lucky to get to 2. Like, oh my God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's peel off a little bit away from that now and kind of get your take on what HA looks like. Yeah.
Hypothalamic amenorrhea.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
You're getting better.
I know.
It's honestly 2 words I never thought I'd be able to pronounce.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
It is.
Yeah, it is, which is why we'll just stick to HA. But I guess the easiest way to kind of explain HA is to break it down into its 2 different components. So hypothalamic is referring to the hypothalamus, which is an area of your brain which oversees many different bodily functions, including the communication between your brain and your ovaries. So it's really important to have that communication between your brain and your ovaries in order to carry out all of the different phases of a menstrual cycle and therefore end up with a period, a regular, healthy period. The hypothalamus also monitors how much stress is being produced in the body. So that's really important to keep in mind when it comes to the amenorrhea part of the equation. So amenorrhea is a term that simply means an absence of menstruation, or your period is MIA. So when you pair both of them together, essentially what that is saying is that the hypothalamus is suppressing that communication between your ovaries, your brain and your ovaries, because it's detected too much stress. Therefore, it doesn't see the environment that we're in safe enough to reproduce. And I know people are out there being like, well, I don't want to reproduce, and that's fine. But your body at a physiological level, that's what it was designed to do. That's what the menstrual cycle, one of its functions is for, not the only one, which I'm sure we'll touch on too. But that's why your HA, your hypothalamus, as a response, will actually start to suppress that communication and turn off your menstrual cycle as a way of protecting you. And that, like I said, is a big factor of that is stress. And that can be physical stress, like we've talked about, overtraining, undereating, but it can also be paired with mental and emotional stress. So black and white thinking, perfectionism tends to be tied in there as well. And all of this can be, deliberate or completely accidental. And a lot of the times it is accidental. For me, I had no idea what I was doing, just trying to be quote unquote healthy. And then turns out I was completely suppressing this whole system of my body.
Yeah, wow. And, with the quote unquote healthy thing, like, we live in a world, or we live, unfortunately, in a culture where, health is really underpinned by that black and white thinking and perfectionism. So it's no wonder that does tend to happen, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. I guess with HA, what are some of the effects aside from a missing menstrual cycle that can happen? Like, as you said, not everybody wants to menstruate, or not everyone wants to reproduce, I should say. What are some other physical or psychological effects that it can have?
Yeah, so the hormones that are involved in your menstrual cycle, particularly estrogen and progesterone, also have other, health implications when they're not being produced. So, for example, your bone mineral density is largely contributed to estrogen as well. So you're always having bone break down and reform, right? But when we're missing our period and we have low estrogen, that bone breakdown and reformation is more skewed to the breakdown, because we're not. Estrogen is a building hormone, essentially. So it helps build things within our body, including, I guess, our bone health. So that's skewed. So we do see when people have missed their period for quite some time, we do see reductions in bone mineral density. Not all the time, but it can be. And then also your cardiovascular health can be impacted. So your arteries and your heart health. That's why when people go through menopause, we do start to see the increase of osteopenia, osteoporosis, cardiovascular diseases, because we now don't have this protective mechanism known as estrogen.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I think in a clinical sense, that's something that, like, I would see and you would see as well, I'm assuming, in that health and wellness and kind of exercise space is start to see a lot of bone stress related kind of conditions pop up.
Absolutely.
I think one of the typical ones, and just working in sport for the last how many years, has been seeing people come in with some sort of a fracture or caused not from trauma, which it's commonly associated with, but a fracture that's come from stress of the actual bone, that overtraining, or that under, activation, or lack of building the actual remodeling of the bone itself after it goes through that breakdown process. So yeah, it's really interesting that you kind of say that, because now I'm just thinking back to, right, like, you start to see all this. You start to see people come through the door and like hip fractures, or with foot fractures, or and you start to put these little puzzle pieces together, and whilst they might in their case history everything might look really fine, sometimes it's an uncomfortable conversation to go down, especially like with a male practitioner as someone that you're kind of talking to, but talking about, right, what's your menstrual cycle looking like at the minute? But something that's really important to kind of cover off, just to put those puzzle pieces together and start to paint a bit of a clinical picture.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think, again, kind of coming back to, like, health isn't a one size fits all. So you kind of got to have these different pieces of knowledge to then kind of be like, okay, well, what's the bigger picture here? And the more you guys learn and the more I learn, the better we can help our own clients, right? Like I know, kind of coming from that, fracture conversation that you just had, Zeb, I'm pretty sure I had a stress fracture on the top of my foot, and like the peak of my disordered eating and disordered exercise days. And I blamed it on my shoes. I thought I just needed new shoes, but it was actually kind of, I know, byproduct of, well, it's also like a very good indicator of where my brain was at. And I think another thing about the menstrual cycle that's important outside of, I don't even want to say fertility, because I remember when I started getting into all of this and figuring out what was going on with my body, I spoke to a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, and they kind of opened my eyes up to the fact that fertility isn't just about getting pregnant and starting a family. Fertility is about your overall health and well-being. So that's why I don't really use the word fertility to describe pregnancy or starting a family, because it's so much more than that. But psychologically, your menstrual cycle, progesterone is an anti-anxiety hormone. So when we're lacking in progesterone, our ability to emotionally regulate, top that off with low energy availability, just plummets. And I can put my hand up and say that I was not a very emotionally regulated person for a really long time.
Yeah. It's like adding fuel to the fire with disordered eating as well, like really doubling down on that control over food and exercise when we're not able to regulate our emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big thing that I see with a lot of my clients too, especially when they start to work on recovering from all of these things. A lot of big and overwhelming emotions come up because now we're not turning to disordered behaviors to try and suppress them or avoid them. So a lot of my work is really helping people, yes, learn how to find food freedom and enjoy movement again, but also understand their emotions and sit with them.
Yeah, find other ways to cope with, life's inevitable shitness.
Absolutely.
Everyday things, right?
Everyday things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously there are a lot of considerations when it comes to, that very delicate balancing act of exercise and the benefits that it has, but also the many, many risks that it poses when it comes to your menstrual cycle. How do you go about that balancing act? Like, how do you find that in practice?
Yeah, look, it can be really challenging trying to find that balancing act, especially if you're coming from a history of disordered eating, disordered exercise, and even, poor body image and low self-esteem can all play into this and what we've already discussed with HA. I think the number one thing is ensuring that we're adequately fueling our bodies. So working with someone like yourself, Maddie, who is trained in the nutrition space to help with this sort of stuff, but not just training for your, not just fueling for your training, but fueling to support your body's overall energy needs. Because I think that's a big misconception too. And especially, you'll hear people talk about, oh, I'm having a rest day, so I'm eating less. And it's like, well, why? Like your body is still functioning. You're not doing nothing. Like your body is still using energy. It still needs the same amount of energy, if not a little bit more, because you need to repair from, exactly. So that's the number one thing. Then we've kind of already touched on the second one, but is incorporating rest days. Like Seb said earlier, it's out there. It's really like go, go, go. You see on social media, you see people's fitness programs that you don't really get a rest day, but all that's really going to get you, speaking from experience here, is to a place of burnout, and you'll plateau with your gym progress. You'll feel frustrated and you'll think that you'll have to ramp it up when really all you need to do is actually tone it down. So definitely incorporating rest days and finding other ways of moving your body that you enjoy as well. So I talk a lot with my clients about mindful movement and finding, things to do that aren't inherently seen as quote unquote like a training session, but still that they enjoy. And that kind of falls into the next point that I would suggest, and that's prioritizing stress management outside of movement. Because while it is a great tool to have and to use exercise to help relieve stress, I would be lying if I said that I didn't do that myself. it does become a problem if it's the only thing we do to manage our stress levels. Like if there's nothing outside of moving our body to help navigate stressful periods, it's a recipe for disaster, if you ask me. Because what happens if you get sick or you get injured or life gets in the way and you can't go and train? Are you then going to start to feel guilty, beat yourself up? That's just adding to your stress. So a lot of my clients and I work on putting together a stress management toolkit and making sure that exercise is just one tool. It's not the entire toolbox.
I love that you say that, because I too use I use the tool belt analogy. I'm like, okay, exercise is like your hammer, metaphorically, obviously. And that's great. And you're able to use that, but you need to add other tools to that tool belt to use.
You go. And that's something that I like ever, and like speaking from my own personal experience, I love movement, exercise and things like that. But I never thought about it like that, in the sense of actually having some really good strategies to manage stress away from the exercise space. Because you're right, like you see people when they can't do something that they love so much and they don't have anything to fall back onto.
Feel lost.
Yeah, they suffer on a lot of different levels.
Absolutely.
It's not just, the physical level, like, and it really does spike that stress up.
Yeah. I love what you said about the fueling as well, Elyse, because I've definitely have had my fair share of people come into the clinic and really just share their story of frustration because they're not getting fitter, they're not getting stronger, progress is really plateaued, and they feel as though, because of the messages on social media and what have you, they feel as though it's a lack of protein. They're like, okay, I really need to ramp up my protein. Here, please help me. You do a bit of an assessment or a dietary intake, and it's like, well, no, you're just not eating enough. No wonder your body is in this constant state of catabolism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, amazing. Well, with that, I think we already have kind of touched on it, but with your clients and, with the work that you do, are there any types or specific types of exercise, I should say, that you encourage your clients to focus on for their menstrual health?
Yeah, so with my clients who are trying to get their menstrual cycle back or regulate it a little bit more, definitely low intensity, gentle, mindful movement is what I recommend. Also, I kind of have like a few training non-negotiables that apply to both my clients in recovery and outside of recovery. And they involve, taking 2 to 3 rest days and making sure that we're not training, any more than 2 days consecutively, particularly of the same sort of training. So I wouldn't suggest training 3 days of strength training for most of my clients. I'd want to kind of separate it, and that way they also get that rest by kind of breaking it up. Making sure that we are fueled is another training non-negotiable. So for us who menstruate, training fasted is a no-go. Unfortunately, that's another misconception in this space, because a lot of the research on training fasted has been done on men. And obviously, like Seb said earlier, a male and a female are going to present completely different because of our physiology. It is different. So making sure that we are training fueled. I know I'm going off on a bit of a tangent and not talking about exercise anymore. But yeah, they're kind of like my training non-negotiables. And then also taking a moment at the end of each session. And this is something really big that Sarah suggested I do when I was reintroducing exercise, because I had to I took 6 months off exercise. So everything that Seb just said about, when you can't train, it's not just a physical stressor, but mental and emotional. Like I experienced that in my own journey of recovery and getting my period back from taking that break. But I think it was important because it allowed me to actually find other ways to manage my stress that wasn't solely exercise. So I've completely lost my train of thought, guys.
Oh, that was really good.
You a really good tool in your own journey.
Thank you. There we go. So glad there's 3 of us. If it was just me on my own, that thought would have been long gone. Yeah, and that was to actually take 5 minutes at the end of each session and just focus on big, deep belly breathing to help kind of tap back in to that parasympathetic. Because obviously we haven't mentioned it yet, but exercise is a stressor on the body. So it does activate your sympathetic pathway, which is your kind of fight or flight response, regardless of what kind of exercise you're doing. Unfortunately, our bodies have not evolved to the point where it can't tell the difference between running from a threat and running on a treadmill. We're running. It's stressful for our body. So by kind of taking those 5 minutes at the end of each session to just focus on your breathing, do a few stretches, just calm your body down and tap back into that rest and digest state can be really beneficial. And it's something that we have implemented at our local F45 at where I work. We do a 5-minute just like stretch at the end. And I really try and talk the members through like focusing on their breathing because, well, F45 is pretty intense. Even on a slower day, it's still intense. So it's good to be able to kind of, instead of going from one stressor straight into getting the kids ready for school or getting ready for work and then stress of work, like you have that moment to actually just kind of calm your body down again. Yeah, chill out again. So they're kind of my few training non-negotiables. I've probably missed a few, but that's what my clients and I will mainly focus on. And I think it also sets them up to have a really healthy and flexible relationship with exercise moving forward. So something I would recommend for anyone, regardless of what their history is with disordered eating or exercise.
That's amazing. Even on my own experiences of doing like Pilates or yoga, when they do that little breathing or meditation section at the end, you kind of walk out of the class feeling so elated and so refreshed as opposed to like, oh my God, I'm flogged. Like,
and just to, and I don't know how much this will get off topic and detour into the next segment, but like even just to wind down from a very sympathetic kind of driven day, you know,
sympathetic
like,
or sympathetic?
sympathetic, like in today's day and age, we're not just on when we're exercising or when we're running from a threat. We're on in high pressure situations at work. We're on when the kids are yelling in the background at home. Where like our sympathetic systems are getting dialed all the way up at the minute. So having those moments where you can actually scale things back with people, drive that parasympathetic system back on a bit, it is such a nice relief, I think, for the body in general. Goes back to what you were saying earlier about not just, you know, looking at one factor of health there, but looking at everything and taking that real holistic approach and making sure that you're doing the right thing by your body.
Yeah. Another slight tangent as well, Elyse, and you did touch on it earlier, but I'm really interested to hear a bit more. Once somebody has recovered from HA, how then do you navigate like training and fueling and that sort of stuff? Because I'm just thinking of so many of my clients that have had an absent or an irregular menstrual cycle. They get it again and then they kind of go back to old ways. And it's like, well, you know, that's not going to fix anything in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it is obviously very individualized and there's no one approach that fits all, which I think we all understand that at this point. But taking a really gradual approach is important. It's frustrating because as someone who's been there, you'll feel like your body's going to be sensitive forever. And the slightest increase in physical activity and stress is going to cause your body just to shut down again. However, if you kind of work with support, and like shameless plug here, this is what Better Balance Training, one of the online program that I run through Sarah, is designed for, is to help reintroduce people back into exercise post-recovery. It's what I used post-recovery. So I worked one-on-one with the previous coach of the program, and she really monitored my training load. We monitored my menstrual cycle. I was still very much into tracking my menstrual cycle meticulously back then. So I could kind of see if I had delays in ovulation, if I wasn't seeing, you know, the same amount of like fertile signs, then we would kind of adjust. So it is really, to answer your question more specifically, Maddie, it is really like a gradual progress and kind of just using your body and your menstrual cycle as feedback. And if things start to get a little bit skewed or a little bit shaky, we just start to slightly pull it back and only changing one variable at a time, because you guys would know if you change more than one variable, you don't know what did it in the end. So they're kind of my top tips when it comes to focusing on reintroducing exercise. But it will depend too, because not everyone has to give up exercise to get their period back. I chose to because I knew it was going to help me have a healthier relationship with exercise moving forward. I figured it was best to end the one that I was currently in to start afresh when my body and my brain were in a better place to do so.
That's beautifully put.
Yeah, I'm really curious, and absolutely deny me here if it's getting way too personal, but I think it's really
absolutely not
important to kind of like discuss, because I think a lot of the time we talk about the process and the journey being gradual, but we don't really, like, some people think gradual is like a week. Some people think gradual is like a month. And then all of a sudden we have people in this state where they've got a bit of a warped perception on what their what gradual looks like, and I know it's a very individual process, but like, how long did it take for you personally to integrate yourself back into some physical activity once you actually started that journey? Because like, I'm imagining it wasn't just a week and then all of a sudden you were like, right, I'm hitting the gym, I'm back. I'm back to normal.
I wish it was that quick. A lot of my clients would also wish it was that quick. For me personally, I had set the goal of building up to 3 strength sessions a week by June of that year. And I'm pretty sure I introduced exercise in February. So a good couple of months. However, they were very light strength sessions. They weren't really any longer than 45 minutes. I was nowhere near. And this is the frustrating part, is because you go from one kind of standard of training to a completely different standard of training. I know that neither of those are better than one another. They were just different for that time in my life. But back when I was in the thick of it, it's really frustrating because you kind of want to just jump right back into where you left off, and you can't. And to be honest, I wouldn't want to go back to training the way that I was training now that I see the benefits of doing less. So for me, all in all, I'd say it probably took a year to get to the point where I was confident in my body. I was able to push my body a little bit more, again, without worrying that I was going to start to slip backwards, not just physically, but also mentally, because the psychological aspects of HA recovery are the reason Sarah and I have clients. Because if it was as easy as eating more and resting more, happy days. But there's a lot of psychological underlying mechanisms that go on there. Yeah.
Particularly when it's so heavily tied up in your identity. Like, again, I'm just thinking, not only my own personal story, but my clients, where it's like, well, exercise is who I am. Like, I'm the healthy one. I'm the fit one. What am I going to be without this?
Yeah.
And that can be so hard.
Yeah. A lot of people, a lot of my clients and myself included, a lot of our self-worth is tied up, or was tied up, in our fitness identity. And without that, who are we? So it's a very valid question. And it's something that I try and explore with all of my clients and help them build that identity outside of training. Because while training is an incredible thing to do for your body for a whole host of reasons, it shouldn't be the only thing you do. It should kind of be like a hobby, like any other hobby you do. It's not who you are. Yeah, absolutely.
Personality trait.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Completely agree.
And on the menstrual cycle, or like the tracking and understanding and, using that to sort of tailor your own exercise, do you have any tips for our listeners on tracking your menstrual cycle? Like, truth be told, I actually don't know much about it, and I do want to do some upskilling. So I'm also listening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was someone, I don't meticulously track anymore, but in my recovery, I definitely did. So I could kind of learn the ins and outs. So at kind of like a very basic level of tracking knowledge, you can look at things like your cervical mucus and your cervical position, because those things change throughout your menstrual cycle depending on where you are. So again, as your body is developing an egg and getting ready to ovulate, it wants to get you ready to potentially fall pregnant. So you'll see changes in cervical mucus. It'll go from kind of like a sticky, creamy to a watery, egg whitey consistency. And your cervical position, if you are game to check it, because it is using your fingers and checking where your cervix is, there's no other way to do it. It also changes. So it actually gets higher and softer the closer you get to ovulation. Again, this is making your body more hospitable to sperm in order to fall pregnant. So again, I know I'm talking like we want that. I know not all of us want to fall pregnant, but again, at a physiological level, that's what our body is designed to do. And it's what it's gearing up to do. And you can use these signs to help track. Now, those two fertile signs will tell you that ovulation is approaching. They cannot confirm ovulation. And that's where I think a lot of people might slip up, is that they see these signs and they're like, sweet, I've ovulated. The only way you could tell that you've ovulated is by tracking your temperature. So your basal body temperature. Now, that's a whole tangent. And if you want me to get into it, I'm more than happy to.
Well, look, is there like a high-speed recap, I suppose,
Yeah.
for listeners? Because it is cool.
Yeah, it is absolutely cool. So essentially the reason we track your BBT, so basal body temperature for short, is when you ovulate, you're producing more progesterone. Now, progesterone is a heat-inducing hormone, so it naturally raises your core body temperature. Now, when I say raises your core body temperature, we're talking about 0.4 of a degree Celsius. So there are specific thermometers out there that read to that decimal place, so you can get a better, a more accurate reading. You could use your regular, thermometers, but they might not always be as accurate because that shift can be really small. Yeah. So you've ovulated, your temperature rises, it stays elevated until you get your next period. So that's how you can confirm ovulation has taken place, because you have what they call a biphasic temperature shift. So 2 different phases. That's kind of like the basis of it. Also, a side note, because your body is running warmer, your metabolism is also faster, therefore you need more energy. So those cravings that you get in that week leading up to your period isn't just you and lacking willpower, it is your body literally asking for more food.
Interesting. I love that, because that is definitely something that I've heard a lot of.
Yes.
That's really, really cool. Oh, that's great.
And then on from that, I think, like, because do you find that then it goes the polar opposite of that? And do you find people become really intently set on tracking their cycle? Because I feel like that has the opportunity then to go down that path too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm like nodding in complete agreement, because I was that person. I went from kind of like being quite obsessive and addicted to this health and fitness space of exercise and dieting to then I just switched that to my recovery journey and tracking my menstrual cycle, to the point where I was waiting on a few of my recovery periods and I would just stare at my temperature graph, just hoping that it would change to represent that I'd ovulated somehow. And I think like the caveat to that is just making sure that we remember that it's just data. It's just data that we can observe. We can't judge it. We can't change it. It's just there to help better our knowledge, but it's not something that we can control. But I do think kind of, for me at least, kind of going from one extreme to the other helped me kind of like find a balance. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. I guess it is a bad thing if you stay in that mindset and you don't kind of find that balance. But yeah.
You get on the pendulum swing.
Yeah, and a good talking point, I think, as well, like in a lot of the coaching space and as well, for those reaching out and getting like psychological assistance with managing a lot of this stuff, like I think it's a really nice thing to kind of talk about and making sure that they're in that balance point instead of kind of fluctuating either way too much.
Yeah, and something that we haven't actually covered yet, Elyse, and look, I know that this probably won't be an easy answer, but when it comes to HA recovery, like, is there a rough ballpark on how long it takes? Because I feel like our listeners would be quite interested in that.
Yeah, look, I wish I could give you a ballpark. The one thing that I say is to all of my clients is the more involved you are in making those changes, the more open-minded you are to adjusting and changing your lifestyle, the quicker you will see your body respond. And this is talking from my own personal experience. I kind of like side note, at the time it's a book, it's still a very popular book, No Period Now What, which is kind of like the Bible with anyone who is suffering from hypothalamic amenorrhea. I read that within a few days after finding it and just realized I was the poster child for HA. Like I had everything this book was describing. And at the time, they call the recovery going, quote unquote, all in. And that's eating a minimum of 2,500 calories, reducing or completely cutting out high intensity exercise, and managing your stress. That's kind of what this all in recovery approach was described as. So when I went through recovery in 2020, geez, where am I? I went all in, and within 2 months I got my first recovery period. So that's relatively quick on like a grand scheme of things. It then also took me another 2 months to get my second recovery period. And those 2 months in between the first and the second, I would probably put my hand up and say were the most challenging, because I kind of had built this timeline in my head of, okay, I've gotten my first recovery period, so 28 days, this will be my second, this will be my third, I can go back to exercising at this date. And it didn't happen like that. And a lot of that I look back on now and realize I was really hesitant, because I got my first recovery period and I was like, oh, sweet. I didn't have to gain as much weight as I thought I would. My body didn't change as much as I thought it would. Yeah, I was just like relieved. And looking back at that now, I'm like, oh, you still didn't have very good body image. Your self-esteem was still really low. And I think my body knew that on some level. And that's why it took a really long time for me to get my second recovery period. And then things started to like eventually even out from there. But that's kind of one example. I have other clients who've been working on recovery for 3-4 months and are starting to see signs of their fertile signs coming back. Sorry.
Yeah. And it would be so complex as well, like throw in the whole, the stress of recovery and finding a new identity and finding other ways to cope with that stress.
Absolutely.
It's like, I imagine that would prolong that return as well.
And that's as well only looking from like an internal or like a thought-driven perspective.
Oh, absolutely.
It doesn't even factor in what's going on externally, like what you're doing away from that, how stressful your lifestyle is. And it goes back to like what we were talking about before in terms of psychological stress and physical stress as well.
Yeah. And, you're going against the grain of what society deems the norm, except like you're going against the beauty standards where we're being told to eat less, exercise more. You're literally doing the opposite of that. You're gaining weight in a society that kind of shames weight gain and praises weight loss, unfortunately. So there is a lot of external factors that can also contribute, not just the internal. You're right, Seb.
Yeah. It's very fractal, one would say.
Maddie's new made-up word.
I was under the impression that fractal meant multifactorial. It does not. I very publicly embarrassed myself.
You know
What does it mean?
It's a hat company.
It's a hat company. We know that.
We know that much.
Oh, I was so embarrassed, and it fully. Oh, yeah, we're not going.
I'm actually going to submit a post to the Urban Dictionary just to get your version of fractal.
Oh, absolutely.
For anyone listening, and I really do appreciate you coming on the pod, because Zeb and I rather really appreciate you coming on the pod, because there are so many people that I know in my own circle and that I'm sure would be listening to this kind of nodding along. If someone's listening and is struggling with HA or that whole relationship with their body and exercise and that sort of stuff, do you have any tips or any advice?
Well, goodness, yes. Let me try and keep this short and sweet. Well, first of all, you're not alone in these struggles. I think the journey and what you're experiencing can be really isolating and you feel like you're the only one going through it. But if you open up even to 1 or 2 people around you, you'll probably see that we've all had similar experiences with food, exercise, our bodies. And I mean, how can you not when we live in a society so largely driven by diet culture, unfortunately. The second thing that I would probably say is you don't have to live like that any longer, regardless of the severity of what you're experiencing. Like we mentioned, very early on in this episode, that your condition or your situation or your experience is deserving of healing from and recovering. I know for me, I thought I had, quote unquote, had it all when I was, in a smaller body and I was doing all the things to be, again, quote unquote, healthy, but I was completely missing out on a life I never knew existed. So you don't have to live like that any longer. There is help available out there, so much help, which is great to see that more people are talking about these things, because a lot of us do experience it. And then the last thing is breaking free from, the chains of diet culture, of toxic fitness culture. It is challenging to say the least, but it is 100% worth it. And I know that's really easy for someone sitting on the other side to say, but I tell my clients quite regularly that if I could go back and go through my recovery journey again, I would. I actually learned so much about it and so much about myself and about the life I want and the values that I'm really connected to, that it was a really, while challenging, it was a really rewarding journey.
Yeah. And look, as someone with a lived experience, like I think that is great to sort of share your story with your clients or with our listeners. Because as you said, like, you know, it's all well and good if you're sitting on the other side and don't have that understanding of what it's like, but you do. And I think that's really special.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was a big part of what helped me recover was connecting to people that were going through a similar experience and had gone through a similar experience. Because at the end of the day, you can read all the information about hypothalamic amenorrhea, eating disorders, you know, the whole 9 yards. But if you haven't lived it, it is quite difficult to understand. And I don't expect anyone who hasn't lived it to understand it.
Unreal.
Yeah, I think that kind of wraps us up. Oh, actually, what we're starting to do with our new podcast host is like a bit of a rapid fire. Do you mind if we kind of fire away?
Yeah, go for it.
Ray, Zeb, do you want to kick us off?
All right, I'm gonna go for. We had a few good questions.
Did have a few.
I like the a book or a podcast that you'd recommend to everyone.
Yeah, well, I'm just about to finish reading The Courts of Thorns and Roses.
Oh my
So it's
God,
a 5-book
this is
series.
like soft porn for women.
I mean, look, it's fairy porn. It's not as porny as it's being described to be. So I was slightly disappointed, I'm not gonna lie.
Slightly disappointed.
Oh, I love that one.
But it's actually a really, really good series. Like I picked up the first book I picked it up just before my final exam this semester, so that probably wasn't the smartest idea. Yeah, I didn't really do much study, let's say that, and I'm just about to finish the 5th book, and they're not small books, so I've just devoured it.
Yeah.
And then a podcast is Reddit on Wiki for anyone listening. It's just like it's like reality TV for your ears. It's just these 3 guys scour Reddit for like the most ridiculous stories, and it's just for me when I want to switch my brain off. Yeah,
Reddit threads are pretty unhinged. Sometimes I take it now, but I'm like,
yeah. It's a real black hole. All of a sudden you found yourself like 5 hours later down the line, you're just like, I'm just coming out of a scroll hole. Where have I been for the last little bit?
I'm going to take a very big tangent away from health here because I think it's a hilarious story. I'm not going to name the friend. A friend of ours was dating a guy, and long story short, ended up finding nude photos of him on a Reddit thread. So bad. I'm not naming names, but it was hilarious, and she thinks it's funny as well. Like we laugh about it to this day, but it was a bit of
my goodness
for her. Yeah.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Anyway, we take us. Last rapid fire question: if you could have a superpower, what would it be?
Yes. This question. Why is this like always an icebreaker question too? Hey, I would say teleportation because side note, I worked on cruise ships for 6 years as a personal trainer out of high school. Sorry. So I have a lot of friends all over the world. So I think teleportation would be really cool because then I wouldn't have to spend. Yeah, it was very.
How long were you doing it for?
6 years from I was 19. And when I started, and I was 25 when I finished, or just about to turn 25 when I finished.
Last rapid fire question.
Oh, yeah.
What's your favorite place that you've visited in your 6 years of being a cruise ship museum? Have you got a favorite, or can you not? Name a favorite?
I would probably say Alaska or Japan. Very two different.
Great things about Japan. I really want to get over there.
Japan's cool.
Yeah,
I've not been to Alaska, but I've also heard that's really cool.
Yeah, Alaska is gorgeous. Best to see it on a cruise ship. I wouldn't recommend going on a cruise ship anywhere else other than Alaska, really, because it's the easiest way to stay warm and dry and still see all of the sights.
Is Alaska where you go through that really rough sea part I've seen on TikTok and like the waves like crash into the windows and stuff? I might be getting this wrong. I've definitely. I don't think that's so much in Alaska. I could be wrong. I had a lot of that sailing out of New York and the East Coast of America, coming down past the Carolinas. You would often get really rough seas. Really? Yeah, I've been stuck on the outside of a hurricane once. It was an experience. Oh my!
That doesn't sound fun at all.
No, I envy the job.
Yeah.
That part though.
Not the natural disasters.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
Oh well, thank you so much, Elyse. Honestly, I've gotten so much, Zeb. I'm sure
I've gotten so much.
Yeah, and I'm sure.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
If our listeners do want to find out a little bit more about you and what you do and even work with you as well, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at yourperiodpt. And then for more information on how you can either work with myself or Sarah with our one-on-one health coaching or one-on-one online personal training, you can head over to her website, which is www.sarahlizking.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And we will chat to you soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast.
Be the first to know when the next episode drops by hitting subscribe on wherever you catch your podcasts.
And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at wedon'tknowyet.pod.
See ya.